If you are going through a difficult time, know that this hasn't taken God by surprise. It may have taken you by surprise. Psalm 139 says, God has written down every day of your life in His book before you lived one of those days. And I would say to you, a great truth is to remember that there is nothing that comes into your life as a child of God that has not, first of all, come through the will of God, the love of God, and the plan of God. Okay. You know, C.S. Lewis said, we live in enemy-occupied territory. And I think that's a good description of the environment right now. We're not living on a playground. We're living on a battlefield. Yeah. And Christians who don't understand that become spiritual roadkill. And I talk about in the book, we have attacks from 3 different sources. We face attacks from without. We're in a culture that has never been as anti-God and anti-Bible as it is right now. We face conflicts and attacks from within. We still have that old sin nature inside of us that wars against our new nature, Galatians 5 says. And if those things weren't enough, we have an enemy from below. 1 Peter 5:8 says we have an adversary, the devil, who's prowling about like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. And yet, in spite of all of those things, Matt and Laurie, we can have courage and be joyful during this experience here on earth. And what I did was, in this book, Courageous, I took the top 10 survival strategies that survivalists use if they're in an earthquake or an airplane crash. Things like don't panic, take inventory, remember your training. I take those 10 survival strategies and apply them to the Christian life so that we can truly approach this life courageously.
So in the book, you have 10 survival messages for us. First one is don't panic.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are panicking.
Yes.
And they think that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and we're not being salt and light probably the way we should be.
I mean, when people find themselves in a threatening situation like an earthquake, plane crash, we're told that people, 10% will fight. They will stand up and, take proactive action. Another 10% engage in flight. They try to run away from the situation. 80% freeze.
My goodness.
And that is what we can't afford to do as Christians. And let's get real personal about this. Not just the external challenges we face, but when you get that telephone call from your employer that your services are no longer needed, when your mate tells you they no longer love you, when the doctor tells you the test came back and it's not good. I mean, how do you respond to that? Don't panic. Throughout the Bible, God says, fear not and do not be dismayed. He said to Joshua. Joshua was getting ready to take over. He was going to walk in Moses' sandals, and he wasn't thrilled about it. God said, do not be fearful, do not be dismayed, for I am with you wherever you go. We need to remember God's promises and God's presence, which never changes. So the first thing is not to panic. The other thing, Matt, I would say is we need to gain situational awareness. Again, if you're in a survival situation, they tell you need to know exactly what's going on around you. Well, so do Christians. We need to be honest about the culture in which we live. This is an anti-God culture. I have called the Biden administration the most godless administration in history. I think as you look at the landscape, you can see religious liberty is going to be under attack more and more. I think there's evidence that the IRS is being weaponized to use against the left's enemies. I think we need not to panic about it, but to be aware of it and to prepare for these things. The real question we wrestle with is, what does it mean to truly be successful? And success, my predecessor, Dr. George W. Truett at First Baptist Church, Dallas, he defined success as knowing the will of God and doing it. And I think whether you're facing economic uncertainty, whether you're facing a divorce, whether you're facing illness, it's one of the survival tips, do the next right thing. Yeah. If you will do what God has already told you to do, then God will show you the next step and the next step. God may not reveal to you how He's going to take you out of that financial difficulty that you're in, but if you'll obey what you know to be true, God will give you further direction in your life.
In a political climate, in a economic, tumultuous political climate, a tumultuous race environment, inside of a tumultuous, economic environment. We're supposed to be courageous.
Yes.
So the concepts of God and what you have written in this book, Courageous, which again is our monthly resource offer. How do you make sure they understand that God is involved in everything in our lives?
Well, that's right. Somebody said it's not what a person does that determines whether his work is sacred or secular. It's why he does it.
There you go.
And we are all called by God.
Yes.
God cares about every viewer watching this program right now as much as he cares about Robert Jeffress or the Crouches or anybody else. We're all in God's work. We just have different assignments in God's work. And I would just say to whoever's watching right now, if you are going through a difficult time, know that this hasn't taken God by surprise. It may have taken you by surprise. Psalm 139 says, God has written down every day of your life in His book before you lived one of those days. And I would say to you, a great truth is to remember that there is nothing that comes into your life as a child of God that has not, first of all, come through the will of God, the love of God, and the plan of God. And if it's come that far into your life, it's come for a good and a glorious purpose.
Yeah. I love that because I heard someone say when God called you, He called you. It wasn't a conference call.
Yeah, right.
He didn't need anybody else's opinion on what He called you to do. And you just said every person is called to something. We're all called to do good. We're all called to be witnesses and ministers of the gospel in our world and in what we do. We're all called to do that, so it doesn't matter what we do except why we do it. But so much of that is that step of faith, that courage to step out and actually do because of the voices around. And we have to remember that those voices don't matter.
That's right. And Laurie, it's true that when we hear that voice and we start obeying God, and then bad things begin to happen, it causes us to doubt and wonder, is something wrong? Has God lost interest in me, or so forth? Remember what Jesus said in John 16:33. He said, in this world you will have tribulation. People may know that intellectually, but when they get that phone call or they get that notice from their employer, suddenly they think, oh, what's happened? No, that's what Jesus promised. He said, in this world you will have tribulation, but then He said, take courage, for I have overcome the world.
Okay, another personal story. When was the last time you heard the voice of the Lord, started acting upon it, and then doubt started trying to get its way?
Well, let me give you a very true story. We were talking about our project at First Baptist Dallas. We started that fundraising project, as I told you, in the middle of the Great Recession, and it got worse and worse. And I remember thinking, what
the heck?
What's going on here? So I had lunch with the chairman of our committee, and I said, Mark, I know we're supposed to do this, but the S&P hit 666. I remember that day real well, that number. It was March of 2009. And I said, maybe God's trying to tell us something. So we said, we're just going to pray about it. So the next morning, I got down on my knees and I said, God, if you want us to do this, I need a sign today. We had lunch that day. It already scheduled with a member of our church, and he was a wealthy member of our church, but he just kind of said in passing, Robert, I know it's tough out there, but I think we need to go ahead with this plan. I said, God, is that it? It's not much, but if that's the only sign you're going to give me, maybe that's all I need. So I walked back down to the church, got in my car to drive to Baylor Hospital, and while I was driving, this man called me on the phone. He said, I forgot to tell you. My wife and I have been praying. His name is Andy Horner. He said, my wife and I have been praying, and we've decided to give this amount as the lead gift of the campaign. And Matt and Laurie, the amount he mentioned was the largest amount of money that's not only been given to our church, but into any church in history.
Wow.
It was, I almost drove off the road. I couldn't believe it. And I told him my story. He said, you know, I don't know why I called you today. We've been planning to do this for 6 months.
Just
Well, I know
forgot.
why
Wow.
he did. I mean, God
Yeah.
spoke and God led. So to answer your question, yes, there are times I've doubted, but God is always blessed moving forward.
At TBN, our mission is to use every available means to reach as many individuals and families as possible with the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ.
Thank you for helping make the gospel of grace go around the world.
Without you, we couldn't do it. God bless you.